there's another perspective I think is worth thinking about here. If we actually look at Floresiensis, and particularly this LB1 specimen, something surprising comes out, I think, and when we relate her to what's going on with the other hominins. We look at LB1, okay, in terms of stature, she's actually very similar to what we see in terms of Afarensis. Okay, at the lower end of the range, admittedly, but within that range. If we look at limb proportions, okay, what I've put on the board here, we've got this. This is basically a measure of limb proportions, the intermembral index. So it's a relationship between the upper limbs and the lower limbs. Okay, and we have humans here. Okay, we have chimpanzees here, orangutans up here, and gorillas. Okay, and look who's next door to LB1, Lucy. AL2881 is Lucy. So we have LB1 not only being similar in terms of stature, but also similar in terms of limb proportions. If we look at cranial capacity, then basically LB1 is at the lower range of variation for the Australopiths. Okay, so we've got Australopiths ranging about 410 cubic centimetres for KNMWT 17,000, up to about 480 cubic centimetres for SDS5. There are some smaller individuals, so LB1 is in the early Australopith range. And she's far below what we see for any of the early Homo specimens. So at 380 cubic centimetres, she's considerably smaller than the smallest of the specimens that have been assigned to early Homo. KNMER 1813 is about 509 cubic centimetres. So we have some interesting things coming out here in terms of the fit between Floresiensis and the Australopiths. Okay, and what I'm suggesting is that if we look at this scheme, that maybe rather than having the uncertain status here, that probably or possibly Floresiensis should be considered to be an Australopith, a late surviving Australopith, which is probably anathema to many paleoanthropologists, but just worth highlighting that Alan Cross, one of my PhD students, and I've been doing some modelling work recently, looking to see where hominins with the sort of morphology that Lucy has in terms of limb proportions and body shape would have been able to move in terms of their thermoregulation. So where they would have been able to distribute in the old world without running into problems in terms of thermoregulation. This black line is the upper limit. And of course, Flores is well within that area. Okay, and I'll finish there. Thank you.
So I hope you all took very good notes. So we'll have the exam at the end of the last lecture. So as usual, we open it up for questions. I ask you to keep your questions short enough that I can repeat them so that we can catch them on the video cast. So I'm going to move over here because I really can't see. So, sir.
Just in terms of the cradle of humanity and the iconic Rift Valley and the savanna opening up, that doesn't seem to hold when we see these species from a much wider range. So what adaptive pressures are we now imagining for bipedalism, which I guess is the common denominator of all these species?
So the question is, the traditional story was that hominins evolved in the Rift Valley, and it was consistent with this idea of the savanna opening up, and we were moving on to the plains and for some reason had to stand up. And now we've seen an amazing diversity that doesn't suggest that. So the question is, what are the current ideas about why we stood up?
Well, as I mentioned, I've got the list, yeah. Yeah, this is one of the hotly contested issues that remains, as far as I can tell, there's really no consensus, and people really haven't digested fully the implications of finding many of these early species in more wooded, more closed habitats. There's been some very interesting work done by a guy called Kevin Hunt, where he went out to Gombe with the chimpanzees and was looking to see under what conditions chimpanzees stand upright, which they, as I showed a picture earlier of a chimpanzee doing it. And it seemed to be that the time, they didn't do it very much when he was watching, but the times they did, it was overwhelmingly linked to foraging. Okay, so they would stand up to access food packages, essentially. So that seems like, but given that, this has to be a behaviour that's within the range of the behavioural repertoire of the common hominid ancestor to start with, and if we think that chimpanzees are, their behaviour is sort of a reasonable proxy for that, that seems a sort of reasonable starting point for thinking about the adaptive importance of bipedalism. It obviously raises the question, however, if it's such a good thing to do, why didn't chimpanzees go down that route? And that becomes an interesting conundrum. One suggestion has been that what we actually see with chimpanzees and hominins are basically two alternative approaches to dealing with an increasingly patchy landscape in terms of food packages, where hominin bipedalism is basically more energetically efficient than chimpanzee quadrupedalism. So that's one way of coping with sort of increasing spread of resources, of fruiting trees, for example. Chimpanzees operate this interesting social system that's known as fission fusion. So sometimes they come together in fairly large groups, and other times they break up into much smaller parties to forage. And it seems the times that they come together in large groups is when the trees are fruiting, in particular. So it's been suggested that these sort of represent two sort of solutions to the same problem. So let's say it's not really a situation where we can. I don't think anywhere close to claim to being, have resolved the evolutionary significance of bipedalism. But those sort of hypotheses, I think, sort of start pushing down some interesting routes. The other argument that I think is worth bearing in mind here is the thermoregulation one that was put forward by Peter Wheeler in the 1990s, where he basically argued that there's some side effects of being, one of the side effects of being bipedal that's beneficial is that it actually reduces the impact of the sun's rays, and relative to a quadruped like a chimpanzee. So it might be a situation which we get sort of a number of sort of compounding factors involved. But as I say, this is, I think, one of the sort of remaining big issues in paleoanthropology.